Hi there, welcome to Political Scope. I'm Nia Suban, and as usual, my guest is the Secretary to the Cabinet and also the head of the Presidential Secretariat, Dr. Roger Luncheon. Dr. Luncheon, let me welcome you. And this evening, our topic will be Election 2015 and related issues to Election 2015 scheduled for May 11th.
Good night, Niaz, and good night, listeners.
Doc, as the 10th Parliament is about to come to an end sometime soon, I think that probably will be put in place. When you look back over the last 3 years, how would you describe the 10th Parliament?
Tentatively, because I must admit, as you pointed out in your opening statement, it is about to come to an end. The 10th Parliament has been, for me, and I suspect for most Guyanese, a disappointment, particularly one that followed the 8th and the 9th Parliament with the promises of much greater achievements, consolidation, and an acceleration of what was achieved over the last two terms, and particularly the last term, 2006 to 2011, of the Jagdeo administration. And I said it was a kind of a disappointment. In retrospect, one might ask the question, did we expect too much in the context of the novelty of the 10th Parliament? You would recall that the 10th Parliament, for the first time in the legislative history in the post-independent Guyana, we had a governing party without a plurality in Parliament. This hybrid Westminster model that we have inherited and we have been continuing, the People's Progressive Party civic government did not have a plurality in Parliament. And that novelty was so impactful on the developments in the 10th Parliament that I would not hesitate in saying, more than any other factor, it has contributed to what seems practically unalterable, the early demise of the 10th Parliament, that minority parliament. Fundamental to parliamentary democracies, the Constitution, whether written or unwritten, and some clear understandings about separation of power. Somewhere along the line, the opposition in the 10th Parliament totally misconstrued, and this is notwithstanding efforts at all conceivable levels to correct this misconception, but they held fast to this misconception about separation of powers. And they acted, their entire thesis was the parliamentary one-seat majority essentially replace the executive government. Of course, they themselves recognize the inherent fallacy of that argument. But I would want to put that they found irresistible the lure that they imagined that they had where power was concerned. And inevitably, parliamentary gridlock And along the way, the goodwill, the ambitions, the expectations of the Guyanese people were frittered away. And President Ramotar had no option but at the penultimate moment to make that decision that sees us ultimately going into a May the 11th general and regional elections.
Before we talk about the election, I heard you said just now that maybe there was probably some, or maybe too much expectations on the government behalf. But when the results were announced in 2011, was there any semblance of optimism by the government that maybe this probably can work?
There had to be. One cannot divorce the reality of the 2001, 2006, and more so the 2006 and the 2011 developments from Guyana, from the creation of a reasonable expectation among Guyanese people. The same government was returned. Donald Ramotar now is the president. The same PPP Civic, a manifesto similar to the 2006 manifesto, that was the 2011, 2016 manifesto. So indeed, reasonable expectations arose. Reasonable expectations were there to say, notwithstanding this new creature, a minority government, notwithstanding the loss of the parliamentary plurality, the PPP civic government would be able to continue the traditions, would be able to continue to consolidate and maintain the momentum that had been developing over 2001, 2006, 2006 to 2011.
That might have been on the Guyanese people's behalf, but the question was mostly pointed to the opposition, where the government probably thought that there was some semblance of optimism that the minority dispensation could have actually worked with the opposition, having a one-seat majority in parliament. Was there any?
Well, the notion that has to be dispensed with, is that what can work elsewhere can work in Guyana. That is it. Because indeed, novel as it is, this is a minority government, novel as it is in the Guyana's context, parliamentary context, this is, I wouldn't say it's par for the course, but it is extremely common, even here in our hemisphere, our neighbors in Suriname. And then as you go further afield, minority governments dot the horizon, the government horizon in Europe and elsewhere. So I don't think that the expectation that because it was novel, it would fail, gripped the decision makers and the body politic. Like the old people would say, the proof of the pudding was in the eating. Indeed, it is when we came to grips with this, what I said initially, this misconception about separation of power, then we realized that, you know what, the body culture, the body politic, and the political culture that existed in Guyana was probably not equivalent, not adequate for the task of ensuring that a minority government was and could be as effective as a majoritarian government.
Would you therefore say that the lack of understanding, if I can use that term, in terms of the separation of powers by the opposition might have been a major factor for this dispensation not working?
Well, as I said to you, I don't believe that the misconception was inadvertent, because then it would have been correctable. This misconception, it was almost hallowed. It became almost a feature of the opposition. And therefore, it sort of suggested that for them, for the opposition, it wasn't a misconception. That they, I would use the word guardedly, honestly, zealously, no doubt, felt that their control of Parliament gave them some inside avenue to executive power.
On May 11th, the May 11th election coming up will be about the fifth election since the PPP government has been in office. But this will be the second occasion that there will be a shortened term for the PPPC civic administration. The 1997 to the 2001 would have been the first shortened term, and this will be the second one. Are there similarities, any differences between the first and now the second?
Well, I'll put it this way, if one wants to be truly historical and remove these artificial divides, one sees that this is really the third. Because indeed, the suspension of the Constitution and the removal of the Cheddi Jagan government, that for all intents and purposes was the force.
That's in 1953 you're talking about?
Now, this was a removal. This was not just taken away a few years. This was a removal. No doubt, these other two, post-independence, and it must be contrasted with the efforts successful that the PNC regime made on 2 times to increase their terms. You can't forget that. At the same post-independence period, on 2 occasions, 78 to 80 and 90 to 92. Whilst at the very same post-independence period, the People's Progressive Party suffered. Now, the first episode, I think the clear impression had to be violence and post-electoral violence related. Much has been written, and I suspect much more will be written about the Herdmanston Accord and that period. Suffice it to say that maturely the People's Progressive Party consulted, collaborated with the local stakeholders, the body politic, and external, particularly CARICOM and the Commonwealth, and there was a restoration of normalcy that saw the 2001 elections that the People's Progressive Party won hands up. This one here is qualitatively different. This one here is qualitatively different. The specter of violence-induced shortening of term is no longer on the table. I think the body politic has rejected electoral violence or violence surrounding political issues as a primary method, a primary mechanism for forcing regime change. Regime change comes through the ballot box. And therefore, the issue became how to essentially ensure that there was a commitment and no confidence motion, the no confidence motion, that in some way the AFC inveigled, and I use the term guardedly, the AFC inveigled the ACNUC to embrace, turned out ultimately to be one of the more, what I should consider, effective mechanisms for dealing with the termination, the loss, and the end prematurely of the life of the 10th Parliament. So there are some similarities, the end of the term, but there are differences in the sophistication with the tools that are used. One, if we accept my 3 periods, the brutal imposition of the colonial masters. The second one, in the street, violence, political violence. And here, I would want to believe the sophistication of the political engagement between the opposition parties as they proceeded to embrace the no confidence motion.
But would you say all 3 instances had the same objective or have the same objective?
They ended up with the same outcome. They ended up with the same outcome. A People's Progressive Party government losing its reign in government at that point in time.
So this will be like about 3 years, just over 3 years in this second shortened
in
period.
This one here, the expectation, the post-independence expectation, we first met in January 2012. Constitutionally, the Parliament stands dissolved 5 years thereafter. So this Parliament could have served until 2017, January. It is the elections on May the 11th essentially would see the dissolution of Parliament within 3 months of that date.
Of course, we don't know what the outcome will be, but some are probably saying that you probably can have back. You can either have a PPP victory, you can have the same dispensation, or possibly the other option. In terms of a minority government, some critics have been saying that maybe the time has come to have some kind of constitutional reform that can allow for a post-election coalition, so that a minority government would not necessarily form the executive. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't seen a constitution that precludes minority governments. And indeed, minority governments, I suspect, are here to stay. And the constitutional tinkering that would preclude, let's say they are purists who are, in your understanding, trying to do away with minority governments in toto. The constitutional tinkering that would lead to the abolition of minority governments are extraordinarily profound. So profound that my suspicions, and this is just luncheon suspicions, my suspicions are to be grasped, to be understood, to be embraced by the electorate, to change our electoral system. It probably would take quite some doing.
I mean, it will take everyone's efforts to ensure that this can work. Because let's say if we can go at one scenario that there's a repeat of the current dispensation at May 11th, the Guyanese people may become wary now that if this is here to stay, then we have to find a way to make it work in the interest of the country.
Not make it disappear, not eliminate, but as in other jurisdictions where minority governments are seen as inevitable, seen as a constant to make minority governments effective, which feeds back into the body politic and the political culture that indeed matures to grapple with the reality of minority governments. That stage we have not arrived at, as amply illustrated by the 10th Parliament. We just ain't ready to deal with what the implications of effective minority government call for in the 10th Parliament. My take, it was novel, and the underpinnings weren't there. The underpinnings weren't there.
What would you say would be those underpinnings?
Well, I tell you, we keep saying this since time immemorial. I remember one of the more hallowed engagements at State House during the Jack Deo's term. And we recognize, I don't know how big those letters were, but in my mind, that word trust, T-R-U-S-T, trust, dominated the whole conversation, the whole dialogue, trust. If you're talking about minority governments, you're talking essentially about conventions, and you're talking about trust. Alarmingly, what the 10th Parliament, 211 to 214, has illustrated for even the most discerning is we have still dodged by significant lack of trust, distrust, mistrust, all kinds of trust except trust among the body politic.
To go back to what I say, it will take the efforts of all to make this work and probably to build the trust that you're talking about. But the ordinary people may say, well, this is vested in the politicians to find a way to make it work. How difficult is that?
Well, it probably is indeed vested in the politicians, but it arises from the groundswell. The Political Affairs Committee, it addressed fundamentally those elements in our society in the colonial era that one didn't depend on the politicians. It was the people who impressed on the politicians, the jargons of this world, that these interventions were necessary. I see a parallel that indeed, as we come to understand that the trajectory for Guyana's development depend on the parties coming together and working out the mechanisms that would allow contributions in as inclusive a way as possible, that that message would be unerringly sent to their representatives. Right now, I would want to hazard a guess that there exists a disconnect, that out there is a substantial recognition. There is actually more than a recognition. There is that level of collaboration and working together among the Guyanese people. I would want to feel, if I am bold enough to say it, it is at the level of our body politic where these differences are generated and perpetrated.
You mentioned earlier about the misconceived notion about the separation of power that probably would have been a factor in us having to go to the May 11 election. But on the question of trust, would you say that the Linden Electricity subsidiary that came up in Parliament for some discussions and basically created some challenges. Would you say that was an example of a lack of trust in some way?
It was the first, what I might call, recognized example. It was the first recognized example. But, you know, I would concede today, when we look back at how venomous were the reactions that underpinning that agreement, were quite a few unsettled and rigid, significant foremen. And indeed, if it wasn't that one, it may well have been something else. But I would concede it was the first one. It was the acid test. And it occurred so early in the course of the engagement of the minority government with the opposition plurality in Parliament that it couldn't help but become a defining moment. It couldn't help but becoming a defining moment. But as I have said, in retrospect, as we look at the ferment that arose, one realized that bottled up behind this abandoned ambition of the opposition to collaborate with the governing party, indeed was hidden significant differences. And in no time flat, it all exploded in the face of Mr. Granger, the leader of the opposition.
But the opposition has on many occasions accused the government of not wanting to cooperate in the interests of moving these issues forward. How would you respond to that?
Well, opposition's government, the accusations will be bandied around. There is no doubt, though, that the fundamental point that I made about the separation of power cannot be denied. There is no way it could be denied. Every major engagement around which a fracture line developed unerringly pointed to this misconception that the majority in Parliament, the opposition in Parliament, although the majority, but the opposition in Parliament kept insisting that that gave them some peculiar right to the exercise of executive authority.
Not to belabor the point, and I know you can't speak for the opposition, but basically it's one constitution and everyone is reading from the same constitution. As a seasoned politician, were you disappointed that they could not have really understand in some way that this is what is in the constitution and you guys need to come to grips with this?
I keep coming back to the point. I don't think this ever is a failure of understanding. This is not a failure of understanding. It is perhaps a way in which the opposition seized a tool to address fundamental problems that they had with the current dispensation. In other words, if the opposition, not if, since the opposition felt that this PPP civic government was not as inclusive as they would want to, as the opposition would like, what better tool than the majority in Parliament to use to indeed frustrate, delay, frustrate, reverse, indeed to make governing as difficult as possible. And that led them to unleash a 3-year campaign, a 3-year campaign that resolutely opposed the government at every conceivable step that dealt with picking up the 2011 trajectory and continuing that onwards.
There was some talks about maybe, or some people were saying that maybe the election should have probably been called earlier than May 11th, 2015. Was it a case that the government was really hoping that dialogue could have actually worked following prorogation of Parliament?
Called, well, I wasn't aware, called earlier.
No, no. There were some sentiments being expressed in the media that maybe after what happened in Linden and so on, that maybe that was a time to go to the electorate
in
back again.
2012?
No, it probably would have been sometime in 2013. There were some calls by letter writers, and some people were pontificating that maybe the government should have had the elections earlier.
I would say this.
But my question was basically based as whether the government believed that dialogue could have actually worked to break the gridlock.
I would say this. I was party to many, I would say. Wasn't party to all of them, but many of the engagements between the president and his consultations with the leader of the opposition. And I think the records would show that that sentiment wasn't shared by either of those two leaders in the government, the executive government, and in the parliament. That is, bringing elections earlier than it actually was. A matter of fact, if you were to ask me, my recollections were on efforts being made to get the entire term of office served and not to interrupt it on those bases that it finally ended up being terminated, interrupted on.
But was there any buying to that by the opposition?
No, I'm saying that this was
Okay.
the conclusions that arose repetitively in those engagements between the president and the leader of the opposition. I didn't sense in any way in those engagements at which I was a party that any one of the two leaders were disposed to having elections early. That's general and regional elections.
So maybe this all goes back now to the no confidence motion.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
At a certain point in time, the tool to terminate the 10th Parliament was actually put on the table by the AFC.
Clearly, a discussion like this, we cannot avoid talking about prorogation and the life it took on of its own. In retrospect, when you reflect on that, there has been discussions on both sides, merits and demerits of that. How would you reflect on that step?
The move, I think, we'll have to concede it was one, we may very well argue, that desperately sought to arrest a visible deterioration in the status quo, and that was leading inexorably in a direction that I would want to believe the president found unfavorable, both for the government and specifically for Guyana in terms of dealing with unresolved issues. I think his rather carefully crafted statements when he spoke about what his intentions were. Of course, this was after those intentions had been dashed by Mr. Granger's rejection. But his intentions were essentially to preserve the life of the 10th Parliament. Preserve the life of the 10th Parliament. And unfortunately, the elections on May the 11th, for all intents and purposes, has abjectly reflected a failure on his part and the ruse to the tool, the constitutional tool of prorogation to achieve that ambition.
As we head to this election, Dr. Luncheon, and you reflect over the last 2 decades, or just over the last 2 decades, how would you describe the PPP's role in post-independence development of Guyana?
The People's Progressive Party, particularly in the post-independent period, has historic responsibilities to Guyana. Many have said and commented on the history of the People's Progressive Party, so linked with the history of Guyana and its development, both socially, both politically, both ideologically. And that ideological responsibility, the historical responsibility, the moral responsibility, even its legitimate responsibility to the contributions to the development of Guyana are essentially unassailable. Unassailable. The party has indeed established itself as the premier political organization. It is not only in terms of its organizational merits, I think a recognition that it is truly a national party. Very few of those who aim to have the same recognition of the People's Progressive Party can indeed match up in these critical areas where the Guyanese context is actually examined. I could use race, we could use class, we could use ideology, wherever it matters. The People's Progressive Party over the years, pre-independence and definitely post-independence, has staked its claims to that premier responsibility. And it's one that has been taken seriously. And not only taken seriously, has seen its, what I should call, its call impacting on the party and having it elected at free and fair elections from 1992 all the way to 2011. So it's historical, it's moral, it's legitimate responsibilities indeed are part and parcel of the fabric of where Guyana goes. And our party, the People's Progressive Party, discharging those responsibilities, it contributes significantly to the future of Guyana. Putting it another way, our ability, the People's Progressive Party ability to discharge its historical responsibility, the People's Progressive Party ability to discharge its moral responsibility, its legitimate responsibility to Guyana and the people of Guyana is what ensures that Guyana will continue to progress.
On that note, I want to ask you then, what can people expect? What can they look forward to in the 11th Parliament?
2011 has, I said to you when we started, been a disappointment. The 10th Parliament, in the context of what happened in the 8th and the 9th Parliament that gave rise to certain expectations was indeed a disappointment. We're entering into the 11th Parliament, and I think reasonably the experiences of the 10th Parliament cannot be totally rejected, abandoned, and discounted. But I want to believe that inherent in those experiences are the chords of what is needed to take this country on its new trajectory, its new tradition. In essence, I see the 11th Parliament and the definitive approach to the resolution of those issues that languished in the 10th Parliament and will turn up on the 11th parliamentary agenda to be dealt with by the representatives of the people who are elected to be one of the foremost objectives of this 11th Parliament. Not only that, I think it is fair to say that we cannot escape the reality. Moving forward, we have to embrace additional resources, human resources, technology in propelling Guyana forward. And to the extent that there are elements in our society, more than elements, there are segments in our society that are not maximally involved in this effort of development of Guyana, they have to be brought on board. This is the way I see this process of inclusivity, inclusiveness. I've said it to my colleagues and I've said it to the diplomatic corps. The natural interlocutors in this process, the People's Progressive Party and the People's National Congress. I ain't mention APNU nor AFC. And I wouldn't say why, although I suspect most people would know why. But the natural interlocutors in that process, the People's Progressive Party and the People's National Congress. The 11th Parliament, were it to succeed where the 10th Parliament failed abysmally, the 11th Parliament has as its major objective how to congeal ambitions, expectations of the Guyanese people, combining in as inclusive a way as possible. The People's Progressive Party and the People's National Congress contributions. The most acid test, 2016, our 50th independence anniversary. The first acid test, the first example where we would be demonstrating to ourselves and to the world that indeed these interlocutors can get together and get the job done to keep Guyana and its trajectory for development going.
Clearly, that is heartening, and that is what Guyanese want to hear. But on the opposite side, when I said the opposite side, on the converse side of that, of what you just said, would be the challenges to make that happen. Are you thinking along those lines already?
The challenge is simple. It is inconceivable that any other political or governing party than the People's Progressive Party could engender that environment to do precisely that in the year 2015. It is inconceivable. There is no other alternative to the People's Progressive Party. This is part of his historic role, his historic responsibility to undertake, indeed, this transition and ensure that Guyana gets the benefit of the contributions of all who are deeply interested in its development.
So as we look beyond May 11 and we look towards the 50th anniversary of our independence, I think Guyanese will also want to see the futuristic projects that were engineered by the PPPC, that those can now take off and take flight and provide the benefits that people look forward to?
With the support and the committed support of all and sundry in an acceptable tradition, an acceptable trajectory, of growth in the Guyana's development.
Finally, Dr. Luncheon, before we leave, would you say that the 10th Parliament probably was maybe the most challenging period for the PPP civic government since 1992?
I would hesitate to say that. I think it would have to be compared with that period of the post-electoral violence after the 97 elections. And indeed, one could conceivably put 1997 and that electoral violent period probably much more of a challenge in terms of the immediacy of the impact of violence. And because this 2011, the 10th Parliament, was one that dealt with more sophisticated mechanisms and approaches to delays and obstructions, it probably was not as difficult a period as the 1997, where state power was actually challenged.
All right, let me thank you very much, sir, for taking time out from your busy schedule to be here. You were watching Political Scope. On this edition. We spoke of election 2015, which comes up on May 11. Of course, my guest was the head of the Presidential Secretariat and Secretary to the Cabinet, Dr. Roger Luncheon. Nias Suban saying so long until next time.
Good night, Nias.